One way that my magazine has used forms and conventions of a real media text is the three colour scheme rule. My colours were white, black and red, and I copied that, which I took inspiration from Total Film magazine, the James Bond edition, with it was advertised in Spectre and it was blue, and it also features a banner saying exclusive, and I've seen that in lots of magazines. Most magazines have plus shapes and signs to show extra information on the magazine. I decided to develop this by adding the word plus instead of the shape. It also fits with the masthead name of Film Plus, which is what I called my magazine. And I've seen this in Total Film, the red edition of Blade Runner 2049, which featured a plus in the bottom left corner, and I took inspiration from this. Another way I have challenged typical codes and conventions of a magazine in my genre for my magazine is mine has a plain background behind the feature artist. However, magazines that I've researched feature backdrops from behind the scenes of the film which are being advertised. Behind Owen in my magazine, it's just plain. However, in other magazines like Empire, the Hobbit edition, there are objects behind Bilbo Baggins, which is featured on the front, and that's the background. I did this to keep the focus on Owen, as I wanted the sole focus to be on loops. I wanted to add coloured lines to the cover as I seen it in Total Film, the Avengers one, where there were blue and white lines at the bottom of the cover, and it just added colour, and it also drew more attention to the cover. It made it look more professional. So I added red lines to mine, and it drew the attention of people that I'd asked to look at it, and the gradient effect looks more professional that I've added onto it. I've added the gradient over just because the colours would have run into the price and the barcode. There are also two lines next to the text that says Buckley is back darker than ever, and it adds shape and extra detail, which I think looks better in the magazine. Most magazines feature a circle sticker shapes with adverts in them for other films or even competition prizes on the cover. I like the idea of this, so I made a circle sticker in Photoshop. However, I didn't want adverts in them, so instead of this, I added an award for the film in the circle, which read Berlin Film Festival Best Picture Award. So it fit with the cover and the feature film. The way that I've challenged typical media conventions in my magazine is other magazines have featured other images of films on their front cover, not just the exclusive story that's featured on the cover. I wanted to make the whole cover just about promoting the film and have the sole focus on the main character, which is obviously Owen, named Liam in the film. For example, in Total Film, the edition of Angelina Jolie in Maleficent and other blockbusters out at the time, which was similar because they just used the main character as the focus of the cover. Where I developed my masthead would be I used typical convention of white for the font, and I placed it at the top, which is obviously seen in most magazines. I found a similar font to magazines that I've used, and I used that. Most fonts in mastheads I'd seen were Total Film and Empire are square with sharp pointed accents, whereas I chose to follow the typical conventions but have a square font without the pointed accents because I thought this fit more with the genre of the film I was trying to show off. The last way I would say I think I've challenged typical magazine conventions in my magazine were the magazines that I have researched are very busy and there are lots of other things going on. However, I wanted the main focus of my magazine to be on the feature, which is loops. Normally there will be other promos and other films being advertised on the front of the cover. However, in mine, there are only a few cover lines which aren't about loops, and I think that keeps the genre within the magazine well. One typical element that I've copied and used from a movie poster is the coming soon titles, which I've added at the bottom of my poster. It's a must-have convention of a film poster, which obviously I've researched into and I've seen on every poster that I've viewed, or at least a date of some sort. An example that I have seen is the World War Z poster with Brad Pitt, which features coming soon in the bottom right of the poster. One way that I say I've developed typical conventions of a film poster is in my research. I've researched into films like Brotherhood, which is typical to my genre. In their film poster, they've got a skyline in the background. However, it looks animated and heavily edited. We used raw photos of a landscape that we took on a hill, which was Hartshead Pike, I think, and we used unedited and unenhanced pictures. Mine was more of the lights of the city, whereas Brotherhood poster had more buildings over lights. One way that I would say I've challenged typical film poster elements is when I've used a landscape poster over a typical portrait size one. I've done this because I wanted it to look quite different and original to other posters out there, a bit more noticeable as well. Obviously it'd be in the style of a billboard over just a normal poster that you'd see on bus shelters or anything like that. Billboard posters are less common, and I wanted to explore this, and I feel it fits better with our theme of our film trailer. One way that I have used typical codes and conventions of a movie poster in my genre is I have copied the loopsmovie.com. I've took inspiration from the film Woman in Black on their poster. It's at womaninblack.com for more information about the poster. And I also added experience in cinemas, because most posters and adverts that I've seen do have this, so that potential viewers can know where to go watch it. One area where I'd say I developed typical conventions and elements of a movie poster is in my research and planning. I looked at Nicole Kidman's film The Others. It features comments like suspenseful, which was said by the New York Observer. However, I wanted to do this, but take it further by adding stars as ratings also. Example, 5 stars from the Daily Mail on the Loops poster. The last area where I would say that I have used typical codes and conventions of a movie poster is I've copied the main characters' names, which are featured at the top of the my poster. I've seen this in a lot of posters, such as Gravity with George Clooney and Sandra Bullock. It adds an element of symmetry as they both face each other on opposite sides, and I think it looks really professional. Moving on to trailer, one way that I've used typical conventions of a film trailer is when I've edited the footage. I've added film dissolves, which are used on my production company logos, and I've seen this in multiple trailers. It shows the flow and transition of the black screens rather than just being heavily cut, and I think it looks better than it would if it was just plain black screens. At least it transitions into something a bit smoother. One way that we have copied or used typical codes and conventions of a movie trailer is we've used diegetic sound from scenes where Owen and Phoebe are talking in the car, and I think this is essential as it doesn't just exclude you from the film with the score of the background music over it. It also adds you in, so you get a bit of a sense of what's going to happen in the film.
Typical forms and conventions of a real media text or a real media magazine is the font. The font I used was Lemon Milk or Lemon/Milk. This is the very typical font for my sort of magazine. The shape of it's sort of angular and pointy like you'd usually find on this sort of magazine. The colour as well was white, which makes it stand out of the background. And from my research and planning, I found that a lot of media magazines followed this convention. Many of them also had another word within the title itself or within the masthead itself, which I copied from Total Film magazines, which is I put film now, so the word now was within one of the letters of the masthead. Another way I used typical codes and conventions in my magazine was with the main photograph of the magazine. The main photograph is obviously the focal point of a magazine, so I made this the loops. Obviously the main point of the magazine is to be advertising the film, and another convention that I copied within this sort of same photograph is the overlapping of the masthead. In particular, I copied the overlapping of the masthead with the photograph from Empire. However, this is a typical convention I found in a lot of other magazines. The final way I used typical conventions on my magazine was with the use of a quote. Now I thought this would be suitable because I copied this off a Total Film, which was for the Bond Spectre film. The quote said, "The point of the film is for you to hate the sights of the film." I wanted to have a quote that had an impact on the audience and makes the audience think. The whole point of the film Loops was to be a sort of social realist, sort of showing the problems in society. It's a social realist thriller, so I thought a quote would be suitable to sort of make people think and make people realise the film's about problems and the seriousness of modern society. One of the main ways I challenged typical codes and conventions for my magazine was with the background. As I've already said, I put a lot of emphasis on the main photograph image. I think the way I contrasted this was by having a simple black background. I found through research and planning that a lot of magazines had an actual background to help with the mise-en-scène, whereas with me, I did literally just a black background. While this would be a challenge of typical conventions, I did see this in other magazines, in the main case, which was Total Film, which was my main inspiration magazine. I mean, in terms of conventions, it is suitable despite challenging it. Another challenge on my magazine, I'd say, is the fact I focused mainly on a singular cover story, which of course was Loops. The rest of the cover lines on the front cover of the magazine are mostly small, plain and in white font. I mean, they are there and the audience can see them, but it's not the focal point of the magazine. I'd say this challenges conventions, as most magazines hint at other stories as being a focal point as well, using arrows and colourful signs and stylised writing, whereas I challenged that. Another way that I challenged typical codes and conventions was mainly through my research, where the main inspiration magazine for my magazine was a Total Film Bond Spectre edition magazine, which in that magazine the masthead covered the main photograph image, unlike in my magazine, which I think I still follow typical conventions by having the main image covering part of the masthead, which from research is probably also used, but also a challenge based on my inspiration magazine.
In terms of our posters, one way that we've both followed typical codes and conventions for our genre is the fact that we've used a landscape orientation for our Loops poster. While many other genres don't follow this convention, for our research and planning, we did find that a lot of them did. In particular was the Brotherhood trailer poster, which we both used as inspiration for our posters, which were also a landscape. Both of us used a sort of cityscape background as well, which again was reinforced by Brotherhood, which was our main inspiration magazine for our research. And like I said, it's sort of typical of an urban crime thriller, social realist sort of subgenre that we're going for. The place where I follow typical codes and conventions for my genre on my film poster is the location of a studio logo. I copied this from the Gravity film poster because this, even though it's not the same genre, it was one of my inspiration posters. This is a typical convention as it's small and it doesn't stand out from the rest of the poster. Obviously it's not a main focal point for the poster, but it does give information of who created the film and stuff like that, so yeah. The typical code and convention I follow for my Loops poster was that from another film poster called Sket. This is another similar film to our genre, where it's a sort of crime, thriller, social realist film. The font for the masthead, not the masthead, for the title was a sort of gritty feel, which is the same I've gone for on my poster because I wanted to give it that sort of on the streets, urban feel. One way I developed typical codes and conventions for my Loops poster was the fact that I copied the release date, placement and style of the film poster Gravity. I developed this by replacing the actual date with a coming soon. The idea of my film poster and all of my ancillary tasks and main tasks was to create suspense, and I think by saying coming soon instead of an actual date, this puts the audience on the edge of the seats and makes them want to know when the film's coming out. Another way I developed typical codes and conventions of my genre for my poster was by basically getting my inspiration from posters that were of a different genre. While I did look at the Brotherhood poster, which was of the same genre as mine, I did look at other posters as well, such as Gravity, as I've already said. There was other film posters as well. There was things such as the iRobot poster, which while it is of a different genre, I used it for inspiration because I thought I'd be able to develop the codes and conventions of that genre to be suitable for my genre. One way I've used typical codes and conventions for the sort of subgenre of social realism thriller is through the use of a main character who is a sort of lower class male who has sort of turned to a life of crime in order to make way in his life. And this is typical as it follows the conventions used in films that have inspired our film, in particular Brotherhood and Bullet Boy, which are probably the two biggest inspiration films.
One way I've used typical codes and conventions of my genre in my trailer is through the location of our mise en scène. A lot of it is located in dark, sort of urban streets. There's a little tunnel that someone runs down with graffiti on it, and I think it's very reminiscent of a typical genre of this sort of film. One way I've developed typical codes and conventions of my genre is by the use of a main character who isn't male. While she doesn't play a particularly massive part in the trailer, it gives the impression that in a film she would do. And generally in these sorts of films, women might often be objectified as a sort of sexualised image, whereas in our film she plays an empowered role. Another way I developed these typical codes and conventions, I'd say, is by the fact that there's no real enemy in the film. As I've already said, our film was more about conveying an important message and so showing the problems in society these days. And so there's no real enemy to sort of glorify and make entertainment from the film. And the enemy really is the main character's own enemy within.